This is chapter 5, the first noble truth. Having to hold on is suffering. So the Pali reads, Idanko panna bhikkhave dukkhaṃ arya saccaṃ jatipi dukkha jarapi dukkha maranampi dukkhaṃ soka parideva dukkha domanas upayasapi dukkha appiyehi sampiyoko dukkho piyehi vipayogo dukkho yampi chang nalabati tampi dukkhaṃ Sankitena panchupadana kantha dukkha. And we have this very graphic picture. Again, these can be passed around. People want to take a look at this. The very graphically potent picture of by Ajahn Sucitto. Have a suffering figure down at the bottom. You can see his sort of face weighed under this large bundle. It's both a burning chain and it's a large sack, and generally there's the most epic expression of misery on the face of the individual down below, carrying this whole heavy burden. And this image here, also there was a much earlier version of this that Ajahn Sucitto drew in about 1978, when they were spending the Rains Retreat in Oakenholt Buddhist Center before Chithurst existed. And Lumpur was invited to give a Dhamma talk at Oxford. And instead of the text here, it was a similar image, just with a large bag on the back of the individual, with a huge question mark in it, and the caption was "struggling," so which I think a few of the Oxford students could probably relate to. And then the subtitle was "Venerable Sumedho will instruct in the art of letting go." And so that was then there's still copies of that around here and there, but this image has sort of reappeared in this particular collection. The first noble truth, having to hold on, is suffering. The Buddha then goes on to expound the four noble truths, the centerpiece of his teaching. They are central because they point to a universal human experience, a feeling of lack in our lives. At times we feel a sense of need or lack or dissatisfaction that can vary from mild weariness to utter despair. This can be triggered off by physical feelings or by mental impressions concerning ourselves or other beings. It's characterized by feeling that there's not enough. Even if we are physically well and mentally skilled, we can feel disappointed that life isn't offering us enough, or we're not making enough of it, or not doing enough, or there's not enough time, space and freedom. We can feel anxiety over the state of the planet and the environment. Our perceptions of the present and the future are not secure and problem-free. Even too much, quote-unquote, means not having enough space, future and ease. The list is endless. Just reflect upon your activities and pursuits. Notice that there's a constant effort to change or cope with what is disagreeable, or to stimulate well-being. This is universal. A couple of points I'd like to make before going further. Firstly, an interesting aspect of the teachings is that this particular word "sacca," so the Arya Sacca, the noble truths of the four noble truths. The word "sacca," S-A-C-C-A, even though it's very familiar to us in this expression, the four noble truths, is actually quite rare in the Pali Canon. And funnily enough, there's something like 540 occurrences of it, something like that, and almost all of them occur in one section of the Samyutta Nikaya, called the Satya Samyutta, the connected discourses on the theme of truth, or the truths. And so it's a curiosity, and then mostly when the Buddha is referring to Satya, it's more often meaning honesty. It doesn't refer to truth as in some sort of metaphysical reality, but it's more the truthfulness, honesty. So like the paramita, the perfection of satya, is the perfection of honesty. And so and one of the kind of interesting reflections about this is that not necessarily that the Four Noble Truths have been edited or it's been altered, but it is kind of curious that word satya or truth only appears in this pretty much in one section of the teachings, and is used in this way in that one location of the teachings. And also significant as we go along and we look at the way that the Buddha describes the Four Truths and goes into each of the Four Truths and their three modes. One in a way, rather than referring to them as Four Noble Truths, as in sort of metaphysical realities or a kind of absolute, giving a sense of absoluteness to them, one can reflect upon them or look at them as the Four Noble Practices rather than the Four Noble Truths. And so that, because also there's a very regular theme within the teachings about not believing things that are told to you, not taking things to be true without your own personal experience being involved. So that's just a little preface to the whole word satya. And of course, being the Buddha's first discourse, this is the first place that historically that you come across him using the term satya. But that is a bit of a curiosity in terms of the use of that particular word. So there are some people who do feel it was sort of inserted later on when the Buddha's teaching and those who are the Buddha's followers were sort of competing with other religious groups, and they had their own satya or their own truths or their own philosophies that they put that kind of terminology in to say this is comparable, this is the Buddha's satya, this is the Buddha's truth, as a way of showing the Buddha's teaching in comparison to or in contradistinction to, as compared with another teaching. But of course, it's just the theory of some individuals. But it is, in a way, it's more helpful. And this is the way that Lumpur Sumedho has expanded these themes over many, many years, is to think of these as not just things to believe in, not truths to believe in blindly, but practices to follow. And then the four different ways that each of the ways that each of the four truths are worked with then become very significant in terms of guiding our spiritual efforts. So the other point to make about dukkha is also, and I'm sure Ajahn Sucitto goes into it in a bit more detail, but one of the things about why suffering is not an ideal word to translate dukkha is because happiness is dukkha. Getting what you want is also unsatisfactory. As he points out here, that not having enough is also that. The classical way of speaking about this or describing this is that the way that a pleasant experience can't be held or can't be owned or can't sustain itself as continually pleasant and continually delightful is part of that. So just as when we see a sunset and we go, oh wow, the startling beauty of the sunset, it can only sustain itself for so long before the light changes, or our attention goes, wow. You can't stay in a state of wow for more than a few seconds. Even if the mind is deeply absorbed in meditation, there's a more continuous wow of pleasant feeling if the mind is absorbed in very wholesome states. But even so, as Lumpur Sumedho would say, even if you had 84,000 eons of life as a Brahma god, when that life comes to an end, it's just a memory. It's gone. That was there and now it's gone. It's also just a memory. On a much more coarse level, there was a good example of this the other day. Someone told me he runs a pub in Essex, and the fellow who lives upstairs from the pub is an enthusiastic Tottenham supporter, And on that particular, a couple of days before, Tottenham had beaten Chelsea 5-3, which is an unprecedented victory. And so his tenant had got blind drunk, so happy that his team, Tottenham, had thrashed Chelsea 5-3, which is unheard of, that beaten this top team by such a margin. And so incredibly happy, got blind drunk and fell down the stairs, broke 4 ribs and punctured a lung. So he's now in the hospital. So happiness, extreme happiness. We Tottenham thrashed Chelsea, and then leading to a stint on the hospital wall with 4 broken ribs and a punctured lung. So even happiness is unsatisfactory. So, to continue. It's worthwhile considering that, however altruistic one's actions are, the feeling of unsatisfactoriness is the same. This feeling is what the Buddha called dukkha, and fittingly, there just isn't a satisfactory English word to cover its meaning. Good point. Even the word suffering is unsatisfactory. Dukkha is not an objective physical reality such as disease and famine. Sometimes having little is fine, or even peaceful. At other times we can feel devastated that there's a stain on the dining room tablecloth. Just to get in touch with that feeling is an entrance to the spiritual realm, because it provides a reference point to where and how the experiences of life are actually affecting us. We may assume that we are beings guided by rational principles, but we only choose to be rational when that cool and objective mode suits us. What drives us, what we find pleasing, inspiring, worthwhile, and the opposite, is calibrated in a different zone of the psyche. To get in touch with that other zone is essential if one wants to live in an undiluted way. By pointing at dukkha, the Buddha highlights a fundamental that we may only have glimpsed or seen as related to a particular set of circumstances. He's not implying that life is miserable. Most things have a mixture of pleasure and pain and neutrality in them. However, there is a constant restless quality of disquiet. With happiness, there is an undertone of wanting more of it, holding on to it, or even continuing to stimulate it, because by itself it changes. And when the source of happiness passes, we begin to feel bored or dissatisfied and seek out something else. If we don't find it, we feel much worse. Life does have its dark side. It can be painful at times, but we can make it more painful for ourselves, psychologically and emotionally, by wanting the happiness to last, or the painful aspects never to manifest. But even the most acute pain and fear can be borne. We can actually practice with pain. We can work with it. We can become serene through it. What is really painful is the mental perception that you can't bear it for another moment. You can see this without having acute pain. Just with life being the way it is. Things go wrong and the mind will feel, why should this happen to me? When you feel sick, thoughts may arise saying, why should I have to put up with this? I wanted to do something, and this has spoiled it all. Or, the weather's not very good, it's ruined my day. Or, why do you have to say things like that? You know how that hurts me. This kind of suffering goes on and on. We never seem to be able to get rid of it in normal activities, regardless of where we go, and no matter what we do. Trying to avoid being blamed, losing one's job, or disappointing others can lead people to states of extreme stress and nervous breakdown. Then, even if our personal situation is not causing us any anxiety, we're still aware of the suffering of others. For many of us, the urge to take on spiritual practice arises through recognizing that whatever we do, wherever we go, this mood prevails, and it even follows us into spiritual practice. I've seen this myself. Being in a quiet place and living as a meditating monk, not having to worry about anything, I could feel irritated at a frog croaking. Why do there have to be frogs croaking? Why don't they shut up? Stop disturbing me. It's not a deliberate intended response. It's an instinctive reaction. So we feel that that's the way we are, and the possibility for change, even if we wish to change, seems remote. Habits and instincts define our identity, and that's where dukkha gnaws more deeply into our hearts. There's also a story that Joseph Goldstein tells about when he was on a retreat once. There was this hut, and there was a stream outside the kuti he was in, and he became convinced that the stream was playing the American national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. And he became extremely annoyed by this, and then part of his rational mind was saying, there's no way the stream is actually playing the Star Spangled Banner. That's completely impossible. It's just my mind. But he couldn't shut it up, and he kept being annoyed by this music that the stream was playing. And he was sitting there wrestling with this and trying not to get upset. But eventually he gave up and went outside and started rearranging the rocks in the stream to try and get it to at least change its tune, so that it wouldn't play the national anthem to him. And so that, along with that, these represent these ways of Ajahn Sucitto represents it. Then this question, why should this happen to me? Or that, in a sense, even more basic, just that feeling of wrongness, or it shouldn't be this way, or the universe is out of order. That's the essential dukkha experience, is that feeling of wrongness. It shouldn't be this way. It's important to understand that the Buddha's teaching separates the dukkha that we experience because of the way life apparently is from the dukkha that is created emotionally from not wanting things to be that way, or from assuming that life is wretched. As is pointed out in this sutta, things change, and things can be effected without the naivety that assumes that solutions are going to be permanently satisfactory, or the pessimism that assumes that it's all hopeless. The Buddha taught dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. The particulars of unpleasant circumstances can come to an end or be brought to an end even if problems then surface in other areas. Accepting that life has its dark, problematic side needn't be depressing. Most fruitfully, the kind of suffering that is the mental reaction to a situation, even on an instinctive plane, can be completely abolished. With the ending of that kind of suffering, the mind is clearer and wiser and more capable of effecting positive change in a world of ever-changing circumstances. So I appreciate Ajahn Sucitto's English can be a little bit dense and hard to follow, even for those for us for whom English is our first language. But I hope you can follow that. There's also a very useful teaching that the Buddha gave related to this, which is called the arrow. It's another teaching in the Samyutta Nikaya. And this is a very helpful image to bear in mind, because the Buddha was a soldier before he was a monk, so there's a lot of military imagery he uses, a lot of say symbols from the life of a warrior and a soldier. And so he uses this image of a soldier being shot by an arrow. And so as we have in this, jatipi dukkha, birth is dukkha, jarapi dukkha, aging is dukkha, maranampi dukkha, and death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Separation from the liked is dukkha. Association with the disliked is dukkha. Yampi chung nalabhati, not getting what one wants is dukkha. And so these ordinary everyday ways of being unhappy or being miserable, so that the experience of physical pain he referred to as the first arrow. So that you have a body, you have a mind, it has feelings, there's sensations that we experience. So physical pain, a painful feeling, is inescapable. We're going to experience pain in some way, shape or form because we're born. That's having a body, having nerves, that kind of dukkha is inescapable. So that's the first arrow. So he said the first arrow nobody can avoid. The second arrow is the mind's complaining, worrying, resenting, the feelings of why me, this isn't fair, when's this going to end? All of that hankering and fretting and negativity that happens around that painful feeling. He says this is the second arrow, and the second arrow is completely avoidable. That is that is the in a way the really good news. And so that when we speak about the ending of suffering, dukkha nirodha, it doesn't mean that when you're an arahant you'll never experience pain. Because even the Buddha had chronic backache when he was an older man. There's many occasions where he will, and particularly in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the discourse about the Buddha's final days, where he says at the beginning of the sutta, my body's like an old cart, like an old sort of wheelbarrow held together with bits of wire and string. It's like an old wagon that's sort of falling apart, held together with straps and sticks and bits of wire. And he says the only way I can experience comfort is by completely absorbing my mind into emptiness, into that sunyata vihara. So basically, if he was attentive to things in an ordinary everyday way, or if he brought his mind to pay attention to the sense world, he was in pain all the time when he was old. So that those of you who are dealing with chronic pain, like the Buddha had that same experience too. But he also knew how not to suffer. So the pain was there, but he also knew how not to make a problem out of it, which is the dodging of the second arrow. So it's important to understand when we talk about the ending of suffering, it's not the ending of physical pain, but also the emotional pain. In that sutta, he just refers to physical pain, but also it works in exactly the same way with emotional pain. So like the sadness of losing somebody that you love, or the painfulness of being criticized, or something that was that was precious, that was broken. There's a sad feeling there as well, but also the same principle can be brought to that, to see that it's natural to have that sad feeling, that sense of grief, but you don't have to suffer on account of it. So you can be experiencing profound grief, but also for it not to be a problem, just like you can experience a headache or a pain in your back or your leg, and for the mind to be completely peaceful at the same time. And there's a very poignant comment that the Buddha makes after Sariputta and Moggallana, his two chief disciples, had passed away. And he was at a gathering giving a teaching, and he said, in this large hall with many people gathered together, he said, it's as if the assembly is empty, as if there's this assembly is empty because Sariputta and Moggallana are no longer here, because they passed away. So that the Buddha even speaks in that instance of his own sense of, my dear friends, these old companions, been with me for so many years, they passed on. So there's a feeling of, it's as if there's nobody here. The assembly is empty because these two great beings have passed away. So, to continue with Ajahn Sucitto's narrative, the Buddha talked about dukkha in a succession of examples that begin with the way life appears, and then take us into the heart of the matter. Firstly, with how we respond, and then with what we take ourselves to be. Idanko panavikawe, and so that's the Pali I just recited. Bhikkhus, there is this noble truth about dissatisfaction. Birth is problematic, aging is hard, dying is also hard to bear. Coughing is also unsatisfactory. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair are all painful. Association with what you dislike is unpleasant. Being apart from what you like is unpleasant. Not getting what you want is unpleasant. To illustrate this, I have drawn the picture of the Buddha's hand raised in the mudra or gesture of teaching. That's at the top of the painting there. Underneath it, an anguished person is carrying a mass of blazing chains. These are looped in a repetitive pattern that forms a circle linking up a baby, an old man, and a skull. To add to his suffering, two snakes wind themselves around his arms and the neck of the struggling being. How is birth problematic or suffering? Well, giving birth is physically painful. And also, birth is appearance in an uncertain realm. Notice how babies suffer. Coming into the world must be a desperate and frightening experience. For the majority of beings, including people in the world today, it means the end of guaranteed nourishment and the beginning of the struggle to survive. Even for the small percentage of privileged humans in affluent societies, with birth begins a life of physical discomfort and the need to sustain or defend what has been born. Yet the obvious long or short-term consequences of birth is death. It leads not to an eventual high, but to an unavoidable decline. So whatever the joy, there is an element of suffering or stress arising sooner or later because of birth. So again, when the Buddha says, birth is dukkha, he's not making some sort of grand, all-encompassing statement about every aspect of giving birth is miserable and to be avoided. Otherwise, that would be I think his teaching would have been very short-lived in the world. But just saying, along with birth, with physical birth, and with things coming into being, there is dukkha, there's unsatisfactoriness there. I don't think anyone's ever heard of a child crying in the womb. I never have. But then as soon as the child appears, and that's how they often indicate the fact that they're hungry or uncomfortable, that's the way they express themselves. They say, idang dukkang. That's it's a very natural and straightforward expression of dukkha. So then he continues. Then there is what we can make of birth. Birth is the unfulfilled, and it seeks fulfillment. So birth is the beginning of need, a mood that accompanies anything that arises which we attach to. When something new arises in one's life, if it's pleasant and wished for, there's happiness, and the need to sustain it, or the wish not to be parted from it. When something beautiful to behold arises, how long can you continue to be thrilled by it? A few minutes? Can you make it through an hour before it starts to pall? How about a day, let alone a year? Of course, we live with many options. If we get bored with looking at the painting, read something. When that becomes boring, go for a walk, visit a friend, go out for dinner together, watch a movie. If this routine gets tedious, regress into your past life, astral travel. Then write a book about it, and so on. All these are more births, or as the Buddha put it, birth. The same habit taking different forms. But that new birth is suffering too, because sooner or later we meet with another obstacle, with another disappointment, or we tire of the whole merry-go-round, or, as some like to call it, the sorry-go-round. The kind of Buddhist joke on the term, the whole merry-go-round. High option cultures just give us a few more spins on the wheel. It's also, to again quote William Blake, another of his fine poems. He said, "He who binds himself to a joy, doth the winged life destroy. He who kisseth a joy as it flies, lives in eternity's sunrise." So to bind yourself to a joy, when you have something pleasant, you want to keep it and hold it, then that's what suffocates the sort of the living spirit. But kissing the joy as it flies, again, this is a very popular quote in California. Kissing the joy as it flies, to be able to experience something that's beautiful, but to not hang on to it or get possessive about it, then that's the as he says, that's you live in eternity's sunrise, or that is the mind is fully awake and joyful. And I think that poem appears in his. I think the poem is actually called Joy, or it's called Eternity, and it's in his book. It's a collection of poems about joy. And then Ajahn Sucitto's little illustration down at the bottom here. Those of you who've seen it, this doesn't appear in the big manuscript, but you have in this book. This is one of a few illustrations that he did when he was living in his hut by himself. He spent 3 years in a kuti in Nakhon Sawan, basically not going anywhere except watching his mind. And in this little cartoon, you have a person sitting in a chair watching a television, and on the screen of the television is the back of a chair with a person sitting in a chair watching a television, and in that television there's someone sitting in a chair watching a television, and so on and so on and so on. So that, and this is something that is a very, it's not. Sometimes people interpret this as being a sour or negative take on life, but it's really just looking and seeing how the sense world operates. When I was a student many years ago, I did a joint degree in psychology and physiology, and one of the books that we studied in physiology, when we were doing the neuroanatomy, was a book called The Physiology of Excitable Cells. And even though the title's got exciting in it, it's an extraordinarily boring book. It was really very, very hard to read, but the information in it was very interesting. So I reflected on it a lot, because what it an excitable cell is like the cells in your eyes or your nose or your tongue. They're the cells that send out an electric current that respond to sense stimulus. So they're excitable insofar as when light hits the retina at the back of the eye, it sends an electrical impulse down the optic nerve into the brain, or the tongue tastes the flavor, or the skin detects a pressure or texture. So it sends an electrical current down the nerves. So it's excitable in terms of it produces an electrical response. Now, one of the interesting things that is borne out right in the Buddha's teaching is that whatever degree that you stimulate an excitable cell to, it will always adapt to make that the average. So if you have a very subtle signal, like if the light is very, very dim, then the system will adapt itself to make that dim light seem normal, seem average. Then if the light gets very bright, of course, suddenly it's shocking. If the light is very, very strong, then the system adapts and the eyes to filter out as much light as possible, and then that bright light becomes average, becomes normal. Similarly with taste, with touch, with all the senses. So anything that we have say an initial experience of that's pleasant, or whatever it might be, that, or even if it's painful or kind of a difficult sensation, the system will adapt to it. It becomes normal. So it, no matter how pleasant or how strong a stimulus will be, the system levels out, and that becomes ordinary. So what that is saying, that physiologically, your whole nervous system is designed to get bored. You can't stay stimulated all the time. It just the system won't keep that sort of, oh, look, a new thing. It will adapt, and so that level of stimulation will become ordinary. So we're rigged for boredom. That's whatever is exciting or interesting, impactful, it will become normal. Not just on a mental level, but on the actual physiology of it as well. So then Ajahn Sucitto continues, the sheer momentum of birth after birth has its disquieting aspects too. You can only be born into one thing at a time. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? Maybe you're missing out on a really great opportunity somewhere else. Then these multiple options become a strain. Can you develop shamanism, play classical guitar, study ecology and cybernetics, have a successful, fulfilling relationship with your partner, your parents and relatives, and your children, come to a mature understanding of the political arena, grow your own organic food, and hold down a suitable job working with the right kinds of people for the right ends, all at the same time? I think that's a rhetorical question. It's a lot to keep going, isn't it? But if any of these go wrong, or you miss out on a really fulfilling experience, you're likely to feel disappointed or personally to blame. So cram it in and hold on tight. Jara is the aging process. This means maturing, not just getting old. Growing up is unsatisfactory because you start to get affected by all the stuff of a confused world. There's a lot said nowadays about having been emotionally, let alone physically, damaged as a child. Is there anybody who hasn't been damaged? By their parents, their uncle, their school, or their dog? Then what about falling under the influence of social prejudice, competitive behavior patterning, sexism, racism? Whatever happened to our childhood innocence? Scarred and stained by something sooner or later, isn't it? Psychologically, one starts to develop instincts and habits, and even good habits blunt the joyful wonder of childhood consciousness. Our habits prescribe the way we relate to others, and of course model our future. The habitual activity is what is called karma. Its key feature is that its effects don't die away when the action is completed. It actually changes how we will perceive things and act. It molds our identity. Through the workings of karma, our own good and bad actions of body and speech affect ourselves and others. Life offers many opportunities to create good karma, through actions of kindness, for example. However, even good karma creates an identity which can become moralizing or is constantly needing to do something, and hasn't transcended the experience of pain, separation from the loved, and death. We're born into a karmic predicament in which everything affects everything else, so our own traumas and problems get perpetuated in others. As we recognize what effects others have on us, our relationships become guarded or take on the form of manipulating or being manipulated by fellow humans. Many people would cherish a totally trustworthy, harmonious relationship, but that's not going to be possible until each individual finds harmony within. So people like to hold on to a few safeguards and have a few alternatives in mind in case this one doesn't work out. But having to live with feelings of insecurity and an inability to commit oneself is also far from blissful. So you see a therapist who might tell you that yes, you do have some problems. Because of this, you decide to have a course of counselling, which can be a pretty painful experience and hard on the pocket. And meanwhile, as you grow up, you're saturated with the woes and horrors of the media, disillusioned by humanity, depressed by global warming. No one can take too much despair, so you seek out some place or someone or some habit to absorb into, just to limit the amount of stuff you have to be sensitive to. It's a shame that, even then, the body, with its needs and illnesses, doesn't leave you alone. Then there are the medical bills. So you bluff your way into a meaningless job and get some insurance, if you're in a society where such things exist. Anyway, hold on, because here comes Maranang, death. Ajahn Sucitto can be gloriously depressing. Ajahn Amaro would often point out that his Ajahn Sucitto is really good at drawing demons, and even his devas look slightly kind of manic. So in this particular era, Ajahn Sucitto was specializing in kind of demonic states and the sort of gloriously dark and distorted areas of human life. You also, but you notice by the end of the book, they're far more kind of broad, open, beautiful, spacious, and much less of the sort of this kind of lovely open skies and rich, subtle tones, rather than the sort of knotted demons that are abundant in the early part of the book. But anyway, on to death. Death and dying generally involve a certain amount of pain and degradation, and grieving. We imagine that death only happens to old, but that's not true. Human beings are always surrounded by forces of destruction that can terminate their lives at any moment. Life involves a lot of stressful holding on, even for ducks and squirrels, let alone for human beings who have surrounded themselves with or invented fire, electricity, cars, and lots of weapons. These are all created to make our lives more secure. The fear of death, or even of discomfort, actually fills our lives with potentially deadly things. According to the Buddha's usage, death may also refer to the disappearance of any mental or physical experience. When something pleasant ends, we can feel sad, or if it wasn't too important, we can remember it and form some kind of view or opinion about it. When it's something that you've done, like these paintings, you can feel critical of them. Or maybe if you have no criticisms, then it sets up a pattern of expectation for the next painting, or for someone else's painting. This can happen with anything that you've done. You think back on it and you always see its flaws. Alternatively, if it was something you enjoyed doing and now it's finished, that also brings an unhappy feeling, a feeling of longing or nostalgia. Death is the ending of the known and the familiar. So, when we come to the end of something, we reach out for something new to hold on to. For example, after the meal, we can go for a walk or maybe have a rest, or there's a conversation in which we can bring back the pleasant past, or plan for a pleasant future, or create and sustain a pleasant present. All that is the movement towards birth, and birth is the opportunity to go through this whole dukkha one more time. Because each birth is about getting what is pleasing, getting away from what we don't like, and fulfilling our desires. This involves a lot of stressful reaching out, holding, jealousy, possessiveness, and defensiveness. We could try to get away from it all, become a hermit, say, or maybe meditation would be the way to stop these desires and possessiveness, only to find out that that's another wish to get away from what is no longer pleasant. So, after the trip to India, the 3-month retreat, we've had enough of that. What is wanted now is the integration into daily life, sharing with another being, or becoming a teacher. And those same old instincts crop up again in different forms. Birth is pretty deluding. It always looks like a fresh thing until we've learned to look at the feeling in the heart. The same old compulsive drives, needs, holding on, suffering. Frustrating, isn't it? A few important words finish off this section of the sutta. Sankitena panchupadana kandha dukkha. In brief, the 5 grasped aggregates are unsatisfactory. So that is an accurate translation of those words, the upadana kanda. But I've always, when using the word aggregate, it always makes me think of piles of gravel. And and even though it's a sort of Buddhist jargon word, the 5 aggregates, it's always seemed like a very peculiar term. And the upadana means clinging, or so the 5 grasped aggregates is a very weird kind of term. It's definitely Buddhist jargon, and so it's useful to think of what the words might mean. So before going into this section, Ajahn Sucitto's comments on it, I thought to speak a little bit about that, because it also relates to the whole previous passage, the previous section. So kanda means a lump or a heap or a group. So when we talk about the 5 khandas, the body, it's a way of easily dividing up the mind and the body into workable chunks, like a way of slicing the pie of what we are as human beings. So you've got the body chunk, the feeling chunk, the perception chunk, the thoughts and emotions chunk, and then the consciousness chunk. So it's if you want to go back to the builder's yard model, you've got the rupa kanda. There's the kind of broken bricks that what you use as sort of filler or hardcore. You've got coarse gravel. You've got the fine you've got the finer gravel. You've got the coarse sand, and then you finally got the fine sand. So you have these 5 different grades of stuff, and you have in different bins that you in a builder's yard. You'd have these different grades of aggregate. So this is just a convenient way of talking about the mind and body, and so making these rough groups. And the Buddha also said you can't completely separate them out from each other. Another interesting thing about this is that the word upadana doesn't just mean grasping and clinging. It also means fuel. And there's an interesting little piece written by Richard Gombrich where he talks about this term, the upadana khandas, and he has a little theory that it's related to the Brahmin practices of fire worship, and so that it would be the job of the attendant or the acolyte, the Brahmin's helpers, to gather firewood to keep to burn in the sort of the holy fires, and so the upadana kanda would be a bundle of fuel. So it's like an armful of firewood. That would be an upadana kanda. It's like a bundle of fuel, and so that these aspects of body and mind are the things that fuel our sense of identity, and are the substance the fuel that make us think think of ourselves as a person, as an individual, as an independent entity. So that when it says that the 5 grasped at aggregates are unsatisfactory, it can also say the 5. It's difficult to carry 5 bundles of fuel. Be another way of phrasing that. If you imagine you've got 5 different heaps of firewood, you've got one under this arm, one under that arm, one on this shoulder, one on that shoulder, one on your back, trying to carry 5 different bundles of firewood. It gives you an image of, oh right, of course, that's really clunky and difficult, and you can feel yourself being awkward and sweaty, and oh right, carrying 5 bundles of fuel, that would be a real headache. So Professor Gombrich's suggestion was that it's not so much a kind of philosophical term, but it's kind of it would be a term that would bring to mind the image of someone trying to carry 5 bundles of fuel, 5 piles of firewood, which will be kind of awkward and difficult and clumsy, and of course you'd want to put them down, or you want to let go of them, because it's really a lot of dukkha. So that even though the English, you've got this it's not inaccurate, but the 5 grasped aggregates are unsatisfactory. I think the way we translated it in the chanting, actually not here. It's the 5 focuses of identity. So that the chanting book we had at Abhayagiri, we translated it as the 5 focuses of the grasping mind. So these are unsatisfactory. So I think if you just, in terms of the narrative that Ajahn Sucitto has given here about all these different aspects of dukkha, birth, aging and death as dukkha, it's like just bring to mind that image of trying to carry 5 bundles of firewood. And Venerable Dhamma looks after my firewood, thank you very much. If you had 5 different loads of it carrying it at the same time, it would be very sweaty and difficult and uncomfortable, wouldn't it? Thank you. So, thank you for agreeing with me. So, so that in a way, rather than that, trying to create a mental picture for what grasping aggregates is, that I feel that's a useful way of representing it, and also that in terms of birth and aging and death, it's that sense of grasping and identifying with it, carrying it around. That's the cause of dukkha. It's the clinging, the grasping that is there. That is the cause of dukkha. And when the Buddha's asked about that, he says, what is the aspect of the upadana khandhas that is unsatisfactory? And he says it is the clinging and grasping therein that is the dukkha. That is that is inherent within them. It's the graspingness involved in them. That's the unsatisfactoriness that is contained within them. So I see the clock has already swung around to 10 to 7. So of course I can carry on forever, but I'll pause there and open things up for any comments or questions, reflections people have.
Maybe I missed it, but instead of suffering as in dukkha, sort of unsatisfactoriness, I find quite useful.
Yes.
What it is.
I think you did miss it. It was right at the beginning of that. It's worthwhile considering that however altruistic one's actions are, the feeling of unsatisfactoriness is the same. This feeling is what the Buddha called dukkha, and fittingly, there isn't a satisfactory English word to cover its meaning. So, yeah, I often use dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness, and that also just to speaking about dukkha, that feeling of wrongness, or that it shouldn't be this way, that the universe has got something wrong with it right now, and that is the quality of dukkha, and that also that within that those simple reflections of not getting what association with the disliked is dukkha, separation from the liked is dukkha, not getting what you want is dukkha. So there's a strange way, even when you just bring that to mind, how you can be struggling with something, and you're working on some job or you're dealing with some situation, and the mind, this is such a hassle, this is so difficult, and then even though you're still wrestling with the job, some radiator that doesn't want to come off the wall, or something of that nature. I'm just guessing that with refitting the rooms in the retreat center, some radiator that doesn't want to come off the wall, and you're struggling with it and getting into a bit of a lather about it, then just to be able to reflect, association with the disliked is dukkha. Apiyehi sampiyogo dukkha. All right, this is frustrating. This is something that I dislike. I'm associated with something I dislike, therefore dukkha. Oh, and in that moment, you're actually seeing that. Well, this is following the rules. Yeah, there's nothing that's out of order. It says this is the disliked. There's association with it, therefore dukkha. A plus B equals C. And in a mysterious way, that it brings things into alignment. I find that just to be able to, association with the dislike, dukkha. Oh, right. It still doesn't mean the radiators come off the wall, but it just means, it's giving you a picture of what's happening.
Having a detachment from it, so the radiator is not coming off the wall, but that shouldn't make you feel upset or angry or...
Yeah, that feeling of wrongness, of it's unfair, or it shouldn't be this way. There was an incident where Lumpur Cha went to visit one of the Western monks in the hospital. He was in Bangkok. He just had a knee operation on both knees. He thought it would save time to have both knees done at once, which he discovered was a big mistake. But anyway, he thought, well, I'd get both knees done at once and get back to the forest. And so he was in a very depressed and miserable state. And so Lumpur Cha went to visit him in the hospital because he heard this Farang monk was laid up there. And so he asked him the question, so how are you? How is it? And so this monk went into this long grumble about and the main theme being it's unfair and it shouldn't be this way. So Lumpur let him go on for a bit, and after a while, I'm not sure the Thai phrase for this, but essentially what he said was, if it shouldn't be this way, it wouldn't be this way. Which was not very consoling, but but it was a marvelous advice. This is the way it is. If you might want it to be different, but you wanting it to be different just creates dukkha around it. So here it is. This is the way it is.
That reminds me of the sutta where the Buddha explains the joy and suffering of a householder and the joy and suffering of a noble disciple. And of course the suffering would be like knee operation, both knees, and you can't do anything afterwards. And if I don't remember the words exactly, but the meaning I remember is that when for a noble disciple, when you see the predicament of pain or not getting what you want, that you actually realize, this is what you just said. This is what I was teaching. So that's actually the joy.
A cause of joy, yes.
And so it's really strange to think about even such a big disability as that the inside can be joyful.
Yeah.
Joy.
Yeah. Well, it's what I say more often than not when people, because I receive a lot of visitors here in Amaravati, and there's huge numbers of people come and visit because some member of their family has died, and they're coming to make offerings, or they want to dedicate punya blessings for their family member or friend who's passed away, and sometimes it's very, very tragic. Just a couple of weeks ago, a woman came who her child. She was a doctor, and her child spontaneously died. Just no known cause, and 6 weeks earlier her child had just died, and it was only a couple of months old. No apparent cause of death, just died. And so what I always, almost every time I'll say, well, it's the feeling of pain is natural to experience that, but if we're wise, then we take that feeling of pain and we use that pain to help us wake up, to say, well, this is what the Buddha was talking about, so that you're not negating the painful feeling, you're not pretending that the grief isn't there, but you're in a way you're turning it to use that pain to recognize, oh, this is what the Buddha was talking about, that jatipi dukkha, birth is dukkha, or that the death is inherent in life, and so that it's in a way acknowledging the feeling of sadness, but turning it to help the mind wake up to say, oh yeah, this is what the Buddha was talking about. This is the truth of the way things are. It's always been this way. Why do I feel surprised, or why do I feel startled that it's just because it's happened to me? And it's very wonderful. Numbers of people who come. There's a couple that come here quite regularly who their son was a doctor. He was 27 years old, Naveen Premaratna, and he died at age 27. And when they first came, it was just shortly after he died, and they were very heartbroken and very, very distressed. And over the last couple of years, they keep coming on a regular basis and speaking to them in this way. And that they have, that even though they're still very sad at the loss of their son, it really has been a mind-opening experience, and it really has helped them to broaden their view of life as it is, and also to deepen their own practice, and to see what this is what the Buddha was talking about, and we were just focused on our lives and our careers and our our sort of family things, and then their death, even though it's very painful, it's helped to in a way open up the mind. Oh, this is what we've been in the middle of, and it's not just our family; it's everywhere around us. This is what we're experiencing, and then that waking up, or then also doesn't just broaden the view, but rouses a quality of compassion, also a sense of empathy and compassion for other beings, other people who are experiencing that same, those same qualities. So it's but that's the challenge, is to step out of the personal and to see, oh, this is painful, but what it's telling me is that the Buddha was right. Therefore, recognizing that the Buddha was right, let's put that to work. Let's use that understanding, use that insight to help understand things more completely. There was another story I often tell about the joy of the householder joy and the renunciate joy. So when I was very new at Wat Pah Nanachat, I was probably an anagarika, or maybe I was a novice, but I was very new to the whole Dhamma practice world. And there was a Thai monk who was staying in the monastery, and he was working on this sewing machine, one of these old Singer treadle sewing machines. And there was a screw that was in the plate, the foot plate of the sewing machine, that was stuck. And he had this screwdriver, and he was trying to get the screw to loosen. And you know how it is when you're watching somebody working on something, you get sort of very focused on what they're doing, and so I'm watching, and he's doing it really carefully, just kind of pressing the screwdriver in, getting just the right angle, and just turning it, and suddenly, bang! The screwdriver broke. And I was so absorbed in what he was doing that my first thought was, damn! And as my mind went, damn, he said, anicca. It was completely simultaneous. It was like, my mind said, oh, that the screwdrivers failed us. It broke. The screwdriver failed us. And he saw that the screwdriver was no longer a screwdriver. That what he saw was anicca. That the Buddha was right. It was only screwdrivering for a while, and now it's something else. And it was a very startling moment, because it's like, oh, that's he's been in the trade longer than I have. So that how immediate it was that his mind went to, oh, it was always an impermanent thing, and now its change has just become manifest. But it's no longer a screwdriver. But it showed me, oh, look, how my mind was so relating to that idea. It should hold together, and it should be doing a job for us, and it's failed. But he saw it in a whole different way. I continue with the chapter on dukkha, First Noble Truth, and if you'll recall, we just got to the beginning of the explanation, commentary on the 5 khandhas, as Ajahn Sucitto has it here, the 5 grasped aggregates. As he says, a few important words finish this section of the sutta, Sankitena Panchupadana Khandha Dukkha, which means, in brief, the 5 grasped aggregates are unsatisfactory. This sums up what has been said before about dukkha, but it does so in a significant way. The 5 khandhas represent the classification by which the Buddha, perhaps following the terminology of the time, analyzed the experience of life. The word khandha is translated as aggregate, meaning a heap. Because the khandhas are categories or groups of phenomena heaped together for the sake of reference. It should be remembered that they have only a conventional reality. The khandhas are form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mind formations, sankhara, and sense consciousness, vijnana. I'll explain those terms in more detail later. What the list implies is everything, i.e. the whole mental and physical universe. The principle at work here is not one of physical science. Rational science has dominated Western ways of perception and activity, and despite its technical brilliance, has created a gap between the observer and a universe from which he or she feels separate. The intuitive sense of connection with the universe, which is the root meaning of the word religion, is thereby lost. This has led to all kinds of disorders of the repressed intuitive faculties. The analysis of the 5 khandhas begins with the understanding, as of science after Einstein, that we are only observing our experience of the universe. There is no separation. Our perceptions and state of consciousness are aspects of the raw material of the experienced universe. So before we continue on with that, it's helpful to consider that in the Buddha's first 3 discourses, he, in a way, takes different viewpoints of the same qualities or the same sort of fact of experiencing. So in the Four Noble Truths, in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, he talks in terms of the middle way, and also in particular of the arising of dukkha and the cessation of dukkha, or this particular way of framing experience, that there is dukkha and there's the ending of dukkha. In the second discourse, the Anattalakkana Sutta, then he slices the pie somewhat differently. So he uses the format of the 5 khandhas, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, and sort of divides up experience into that way. You have the world of rupa, material form, and the other 4 chunks, or the 4 heaps, are the what are called the nama khandhas, or the mental faculties. In the third discourse, the fire sermon, then things are sliced up according to the 6. So in that one, you have the whole sense world, in a way the whole perceptual world is the majority of the division. So you have eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then mind, and so that that is, I would just say it's simply a different way of slicing up the pie of our experience, and so that the Buddha uses a different framework or different sort of lens to look through to examine the same quality, so that it should be seen that the Buddha wasn't giving radically different teachings in the first, second, and third discourses, but he just uses a different framework for each of those expositions. Just like if you were speaking, you gave one discourse in English, one in German, one in French. It's like it can be it's speaking about the same things, but you're just using a different terminology or different way of approaching it. So that, say, in the fire sermon, the Buddha frames his discourse around the six senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and then the mind sense. And in this one, he in the area of the five khandhas, he uses, although you have material form and then feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, and so that they are, in a sense, talking about the same quality but using a different language. Or another example you can say is like describing a tree. You can describe a tree from its biological perspective, or you can describe it from its artistic perspective, or from its the particular qualities of color and form that it has, or you could just be looking at it from the north or from the south, the east, or the west. It's still, in a way, the same tree. So that when we're looking at those different discourses, which we were doing at this time, then it can be confusing. Like, so, well, how does the sanya in the five khandhas, how does that relate to the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching in the fire sermon? Is that the same? Is it different? But that's how I would encourage people to look at it, rather than say in any sort of precise or definitive way to say, well, this is just a different way of exploring and looking at things. So in relationship to the six senses, then there's teachings where just in terms of what Ajahn Sucitto is saying here is that we are observing our experience of the universe, and so that's a very important aspect of the teaching. The Buddha says, the world, what is the world? The eye is the world, seeing is the world, the ear is the world, hearing is the world. And so the world is our experience of the world. And so to some extent you can't meaningfully, in terms of Buddhist philosophy, you can't meaningfully talk about the world without, acknowledging the fact that it's your world. It's experienced through your senses and your mind. So the way that I like to describe it is saying what we're experiencing, like in this very moment, you're not hearing my voice, you're not hearing these words, you're not seeing the sala, you're seeing your mind's representation of the sala. Like I took my glasses off so that Mac is there at the back. I can tell because he's the right size, he's got white on top and bushy eyebrows. Yes, and it definitely is Mac, because I got my glasses on, but he's kind of very blurry around the edges. He's kind of a sort of crunchy, fuzzy quality that everyone in the back row has. I can see who people are by deduction, but only when I put my glasses on. Oh, so I have a different representation of the world, and that's how it is all the time. And we believe, and that's how conflicts arise, and so much misunderstanding and friction is in the world, because I don't acknowledge the fact that this is my version of the world. I think this is the world, so that I use a Buddhist framework or a Muslim framework or a secular humanist framework, and I say actually it's this way. What I mean is, this is how I choose to experience it at this moment. And this is the conditioning that's here. So this is a very, very basic principle that Ajahn Sucitto's alluding to here, and the way the Buddha approached it. Whereas, again, most of the philosophers in his time and spiritual teachers, they would create a map of the universe and say, it is like this. This is the nature of the universe and life and everything. It is this way, like abstracting and telling you it's this way, and that's like the declared sort of religions of the Quran and the Bible and such like. And say, it is this way, and so the Buddha is taking a much more what you can call a phenomenological approach, even though phenomenology didn't exist as in those terms in the Buddha's time. But that's the approach he's taking. Is saying, no, what we're experiencing is the mind's representation of the world. If I close my eyes, the visual world disappears. If I open my eyes, the visual element reappears. So that the center, the real heart of Buddhist practice, is built around that recognition that this is my version of the world. And the more that we're able to do that, then the more we're able to acknowledge that, say, Ajahn Chittapala's version of the world is different because she's German and she's a woman, and that her conditioning, she's a nun, and so she's got different language conditioning, she's got different physical conditioning, she's got different monastic training conditioning, and she's looking in a different direction. I'm looking over there, she's looking over here. So we see different worlds because of the different conditioning. And if I can remember, her world is not the same as my world, then I make room for how her world might and will be different. If I think, no, my version of the world is the version, I'm the sole possessor of the right version, English, male, white, middle class version of reality, then of course then everything else has to be slightly out of tune with that, and that is not the same, or is somehow not right, or not in accord, and then we get conflict and difficulty. So anyway, to continue. Things are experienced in terms of their form, rupa. This khanda is made up of 4 ways in which matter behaves. Matter is experienced in terms of its ability to extend and have size, symbolized as the earth element. Patavi dhatu is the Pali. To stick together and have shape, symbolized as water, is apo dhatu. To have the possibility of movement, vibration, as symbolized as air, vayo dhatu. And to be measured in terms of temperature, tejo dhatu, which is symbolized as fire. So earth, water, fire, and wind. These are the primary properties of matter. Solidity, cohesion, vibration, and temperature. So even chemists and physicists would not argue that these are fundamental qualities of matter. What things are, we don't know. Thousands of years of more refined and complex definitions in terms of elements, atoms, particles, subatomic particles, and quarks has created a richer classification, but is no nearer to absolute truth. And for most people, these scientific definitions are mind-boggling. They're not accessible in terms of direct experience. Earth, water, fire, and air are, and for the sake of proper relationships within the universe, they're adequate. As always, the Buddha used systems and conceptual truth only for the purpose of directing the mind towards ultimate truth, the experience of nibbana, enlightenment. And in terms of the practice of liberation, most of the work we need to do is on the forces that bind us. For this reason, coming to some manageable definitions of the universe is all that is necessary. So just to backtrack on that a little bit. So just saying, in terms of rupa, or the material world, material form, the material form of this body and the whole world and the physical universe, what he's saying is that, within classical Buddhist terminology, these are the whole of the rupa, the realm of rupa and material form, can be said to be comprised of those 4 qualities: earth, water, fire, and wind. They're called the 4 mahadhatu, or the great elements. And even though sort of school chemistry says, well, no, there's more than 100 elements. I remember the periodic table, but it's talking about these fundamental qualities of matter. So whether it's hydrogen or oxygen or carbon or uranium or argon or whatever, you can say that the all of those elements, or those aspects of the material world, they are they're made up of these four particular qualities: cohesion, solidity, vibration, and temperature. That they pertain to all aspects of the material world. And again, as he points out, we're not trying to come up with a sort of definitive, absolutely sort of watertight and perfect description of the nature of matter, but rather to, as he says, coming to some manageable definition of the universe is all that is necessary. And it's interesting that when you ask a physicist or a chemist, so what actually, even the most simple kinds of matter, the simple aspects of the material world, you say something like, what actually is an electron? They go, oh, how many weeks have we got? But the way that matter works, in a way, the more expert that the physicist or the chemist is, the more they'll tell you, you can't really, you can't really define it. And just a few weeks ago, I came across a theory that was put forward by this very brilliant physicist called Richard Feynman, and he said, the people wonder why all electrons are identical. Any electron that you find anywhere, in any aspect, all electrons are exactly the same. He said, well, one theory that we could consider is that actually there is only one electron that is just very, very busy. And it just moves around extremely quickly in its own way, and it does a lot of work, and that's why all electrons appear as the same, because it's just there's only one of them. So as Ajahn Sucitto points out, mind-boggling, but that's we just need a workable definition of this is rupa, form. Things are experienced in terms of mental or physical feeling, Vedana, which may be painful, pleasant, or neutral. Vedana is no more specific than this. As with form, there are many further ways in which one can describe feeling, but this classification gives you a simple way of understanding how things affect you. In the process of cognition, first of all, there's a feeling, which attracts attention. Then a perception arises. Perception, sanya, means the way in which you recognize something as dark or light, hostile, familiar, human, or emotional, or whatever. So before we go on to sanya in more detail, there's a very interesting, significant little sutta of the Buddhas called the Bahu Vedanaya Sutta, the many kinds of feeling. And it starts off with an argument between two of the Buddha's disciples. One of them says, I heard the master say there's only two kinds of feeling, pleasant and painful. And the other one said, well, I heard it different. I definitely heard him say there's three kinds of feeling, pleasant, painful, and neutral, adukama sukha. And then they're going back and forth, and as these things go in the suttas, and they say, okay, let's go and ask the master himself. And they both go to him and they say, well, I heard you say there's two kinds of feeling. Well, I heard you say, Venerable, there's three kinds of feeling. And then he says, well, you can say there's two kinds of feeling, and you can say there's three kinds of feeling, and you can say there's 6 kinds of feeling, you can say there's 18 kinds of feeling, you can say there's 36 kinds of feeling, you can say there's 108 kinds of feeling, and each of those he designates sort of how you get those different numberings, and it's one of those really good ways of say pointing out how people will take a particular statement and say, I heard him say, the Ajahn said, the master, the Buddha himself said, and he said, it's true, I did say there's 2 kinds of feeling, and it's true, I did say there's 3 kinds of feeling. And then he points out, we're talking about the same things, we're just using different terminology or slicing up the pie in different ways. So it's a good example of him helping people to not just get attached to views or to terminology. So on to sanya, and the English word sign is probably related to the Pali sanya. Perception means the way in which you recognize something as dark or light, hostile, familiar, human, emotional, whatever. The analysis points out that things are interpreted swiftly, and it's on this interpretation that mental impulses and attitudes are founded, sankhara. So sanya is the feeling, and as is pointed out in the teachings, that and also physiologically, we experience feeling before we name it, so that we will, if we see something moving towards us quickly, we'll dodge out the way before we even have the thought there's something dangerous, or we have experienced a physical feeling, through the nerves, and then we name, oh, that's a hard wood, a hard wooden arm to the chair. So that the sanya is the naming of it. So the feeling is pleasant, painful, neutral, like the immediate sense contact, as it were. And then the sanya is the naming. So like the word sign, it's what designates that as, oh, that's red, or that's blue. So it's the initial designation and the division of those experiences into their detail. Then sankhara is mostly around thinking or emotions. As he says, the interpretation mental impulses and attitudes are founded. So what we and in another sutta, the Madhupindika Sutta, the discourse on the sweet morsel, it describes how feeling conditions perception, and perception conditions thinking. So what we feel, then we perceive it. We say that's red, that's blue, that's sweet, that's sour, and then we have that experience, and then the thinking mind says that's sour, or that's red, or that's a rusty kind of red. So it's the vitaka, or the thinking, steps in and fills in more detail of the experience. So sankhara, that involves far more in the way of thoughts, moods, emotions, memories, and opinions. And as he says, fashion, cosmetics, advertisements and propaganda are notable examples of how perceptions are created. Sanya is the image maker. And examples of sanya in operation are: we mistrust some people because of the way they move, detest creepy spiders, adore cuddly furry creatures like cats, and buy a soft drink because the shape of the bottle, or because we saw a commercial with some good-looking people drinking it on a beach. Consciousness, vijnana, is that which makes phenomena present for us. It is sixfold, that is, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, olfactory, that's the nose, taste, touch, and mind consciousness. The phenomena that arise dependent on mind consciousness, i.e. thoughts, emotions, perceptions, we call mental, the inner world. Things arising because of the other 5 aspects of sense consciousness, we call physical, the external world. However, in the analysis of the Buddha, this division is not so absolute. In fact, in his teaching, he often makes a point of overriding this apparent division by referring to any feeling, mental or physical, or contemplating things internally and externally. This is because the teaching does not discriminate between what appears as mind and what appears as matter. It comes from understanding the experience of all things, and that occurs within the matrix of the sixfold sense consciousness and its designations. And he quotes from a passage from the Samyutta Nikaya: that by which one is conscious of the world, by which one has conceit of the world, that is called world. And through what is one conscious of the world? Through what has one conceit of the world? Through the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. These 5 khandhas are described as grasped aggregates or categories, and not as causing suffering, but as suffering itself. They are also seen as equivalent to birth, aging, death, and desire. Grasping is a vivid metaphor for what we otherwise term attachment. It means that something is held as permanent or absolute, which is actually not that way. When one is attached to cigarettes, for example, they become an absolute necessity in your life. You always have to have a pack with you. However, in reality, cigarettes are not necessary, according to Ajahn Sucitto, this particular time. So what then is the attachment involved with these aggregates that makes them unsatisfactory? So before we go on to that, speaking about vijnana, this is sometimes it's translated as sense consciousness, sometimes just as consciousness, and so it can be a bit confusing or unclear exactly what it means. But the it's helpful in that respect to look at the word. Vi, in this respect, means partial or fragmented. So in a way, the word discriminative consciousness is most helpful. And then jnana is knowing or understanding. So vijnana is sort of knowing the parts or discriminating one part from another. So vijnana. And so that in a way, it's that the mind's capacity to cognize and distinguish this from that, from one thing from another. And so in terms of the experience of knowing, then in a way it's like the faculty of awareness itself is is one thing. It's like in a way that the mind's source of awareness itself is one thing, but the vijnana is like almost like the process by where that awareness will distinguish between one thing and another. Will say, oh, this is the carpet, this is the book, this is the sound of a word, and this is silence. So that it's basically what can discern the lines between two separate things, or designates this is different from that. It's a subtle issue, but if you think of it, the whole of the five khandhas as a kind of spectrum, from the coarsest, from the rupa, from the material form at one end, then getting more and more refined. So rupa, then feeling, then perception, mental formations, and then consciousness is like using the example of the builder's yard. You've got the sort of broken bricks at one end, and then the coarse gravel, and then the fine gravel, and the coarse sand and fine sand. So in exactly the same way, the vijnana is the vijnana khandha is sort of that most refined end of the spectrum, and it's the capacity to cognize and to know something, and that when we talk about attachment to the five khandhas, or identification with the khandhas. So identification with consciousness would be, rather than just knowing or seeing or hearing, it would be the feeling of I know, I see, I remember. It's the identification with that consciousness is that I'm the experiencer, I'm knowing this, I'm feeling this. That's the identification there with the quality of cognizing. So then to continue, for a lifetime at least, we are endowed with aspects of sense consciousness, perceptions and mind stuff. They certainly appear to be a real foundation for what we are. Is the Buddha implying that we shouldn't experience these, that as long as these aggregates are manifesting, we'll suffer? Well, no. The Buddha points out that holding on to these is suffering. In other words, grasping and believing in the thoughts of the mind and the perceptions that arise, or grasping and believing that the sensory appearance of the world is ultimate reality, that will always take you to dissatisfaction and even to despair. Thoughts and perceptions are notoriously unreliable. People can believe in the craziest ideas and assumptions about the nature of the world, life after death, men, women, and God, not to mention their continually biased perceptions about ordinary daily life. Moreover, even in the most innocuous thoughts and perceptions, when attached to, give rise to the experience of being separate from the world. An inner being, quote unquote, is inferred who thinks and feels and perceives. Why are our opinions and attitudes so important to us? How about form? Have you ever felt self-conscious about the form of your body, or winced when someone called you fat or thin? And yet, is form really what you are? Is that almost incessant babble of thoughts or the ups and downs of the emotions your true nature? Yet we worry about them, defend them, and will motivate our lives around them. Why? Because our whole sense of personal existence is based upon clinging to these five aggregates as our inner being, our self. Although this, quote, inner being, unquote, can never be located, and is really just a mood created by an attachment to the khandhas, it's held to be the author of thoughts and feelings, the owner and senior incumbent within the body, the director and controller of the senses. Once an identity gets created around the khandhas, we expect fulfillment from them. We instinctively assume that we will find fulfillment in our own bodily form or in someone else's, or in feelings that are pleasing, stimulating or soothing, or in great views and ideas, or out of some combination of all of these as they manifest in sense consciousness. And although we always fail to do so, we feel that this is just a temporary fault in the system, just an unlucky break, or that it's our fault. In the West, guilt and shame are more common aspects than self-view than pride. We feel that there is something wrong with us if we're not able to be fulfilled in the sensory world because we believe that we should be. So in that, as I was saying, not yesterday, but when we had the last reading, that when the Buddha is asked to define, so they're called the Panchupadana Khandha, and they say, when he uses that phrase, that the Panchupadana Khandha Dukkha, the five grasped at khandhas, the five upadana khandhas, the five focuses of the grasping mind are dukkha. He's asked, well, what is the dukkha there? And he says that the dukkha is not the khandha itself, but is the clinging and grasping therein. It's the grasping and clinging, the identification that creates the experience of dukkha there. Which is why you can otherwise, if the existence of the khandhas was intrinsically painful or unsatisfactory in an absolute sense, then there could be no such thing as an arahant, a fully enlightened being, because the enlightenment, the whole five khandhas would just sort of evaporate or disappear somehow. But the Buddha's enlightenment, or the enlightenment of other beings, the body carries on. The feelings, the perceptions carry on. The eyes still see, the ears still hear, the mind still thinks, the body still functions and lives and breathes and moves in the material world. So, but and as I was saying also the other day, even though the Buddha had chronic back pain as an old man, and he said he couldn't experience any kind of comfort unless he was completely absorbed into emptiness, that still he knew how not to make it a problem. So when we talk about the five khandhas being dukkha, panchupadana khandha dukkha, then it's important in a way it's important to tease apart the different qualities, or what we mean by the word dukkha, and so that sense of, you say, using the Buddha as an example, that yes, you can have chronic back pain, there can be no posture that is comfortable, and yet it can be absolutely not a problem. And not because you're switched off and you're just dissociated from the body, but because it is not a problem. It's painful, but it's not a problem. And seeing that problematicness, if such a word exists, that's what we mean by freeing the heart from dukkha. So that it's always the clinging and the identification, that sense that I am the body, I am the personality, this is who and what I am. That's the dukkha in the system that can be cured. So then he continues. Thereby we can fall into the two extremes of, on the one hand, naive optimism, things will work out all right in the end, or on the other, despairing pessimism, I'm getting a bad deal, or I'm a loser. In between these two we drift, blaming others and asserting ourselves, blaming the society and defending ourselves, or blaming ourselves and worshipping others. We may feel that somehow we have to get ourselves out of this predicament, but when we are the predicament, how to get out? Okay, did you follow that? When we are the predicament, how do you get out? This endless going on, this samsara, is called grasping at the five aggregates as self. It is suffering. Check it out for yourself. Then consider when you see a newborn baby. Who is born? Is it a man, a woman, a kind, sensitive soul, a burden on the earth's resources, an element of the divine, another mouth to feed, or what? And when someone dies, who is that? And in between that, is it your friend, your peer, someone you yearn for, someone who disgusts you, or nobody special? Something is there, but all that we designate as but all that we designate as the being, whether it's ourselves or someone else, is the arising and ceasing of these 5 aggregates, affected by birth, aging and death, and by the attitudes of the society, which hasn't got past suffering and grasping either. As with the man at the bottom of the picture, as you'll remember, I have our struggling friend under the great bundle. As with the man at the bottom of the picture, the twin experiences of suffering and grasping coil like serpents around our arms, symbolizing activities, and head, which represents views and perceptions. What we hold on to, what the mind perceives as self and the apparent real world to be protected from, are the very positions and habits that make up the experience of suffering. What if we didn't hold on to those chains? Would they still burn and bind? There is the possibility, as the Buddha realized and tried to exemplify and explain, to live with this process of the 5 aggregates without attachment, without seeing self in the process of birth, aging and death. And with that clarity, there is the end of all sorrow and realization of an ultimate truth beyond grasping. Whoever understands where and what dukkha really is on the path to that realization. Speaking of heavy weights, there's a little story I tell people very often when they ask me about Amaravati and what it's like to be the abbot of this monastery. And there's a time when somebody who came to visit Ajahn Chah's monastery, Wat Pah Pong, they'd been to see the place, and they'd met him, and they were talking with other people there, and after some time they were outside of the front of the main temple there, the Uposita hall, and this person was asking Luang Por, said, it's incredible how you look so relaxed, but this is a huge monastery. You've got 40 or 50 monks, 60 or 70 nuns, and you have like 30 or 40 branch monasteries all over Thailand and overseas now, and you have people, I said, I've been here all day, and you have people coming to ask you questions all day long, about their meditation problems, or about their family problems, or what to do with the rice harvest, or what to do with the local government, and it's like a non-stop barrage of questions and headaches and problems. But you seem to be quite relaxed. How do you manage that? You don't seem to be bothered by all these activities and responsibilities. And he pointed over to in front of the temple at Wat Pah Pong. They have these old sima boundary stones. When you set out a temple, you use these big, usually carved, decorated stones to designate the precinct or the area that's used for carrying out ordinations and sangha karma, formal sangha acts. And so he had a number of these sit in front of the temple at Wat Pah Pong, or in this little garden area, these old stones. And he says, "You see that sima stone?" And he said, "They said, yeah." I said, "Is that heavy?" And they said, "Yeah, it's huge. I mean, that big one, that's like nearly 2 meters tall. That's enormous. It's really heavy." He says, "Not if you don't pick it up." So this is an extremely important teaching about the khandhas, and just as I was describing this wonderful image that Richard Gombrich came up with, the attendant trying to carry 5 bundles of firewood, kind of struggling with kind of one under each arm and on your back and on your head and on your shoulders. And that if you pick it up and you try and carry it around, then it's really cumbersome and difficult and a pain in the neck. But if you don't pick it up, then it's not heavy, and you can't argue with that. It's like, it's heaviness depends on picking it up. If you don't pick it up, it's not heavy. So that's the end of that chapter. So I'd like to open things up for comments, questions, anything that needs clarifying. Mac, yeah.
Regarding what you were saying about physics and subatomic particles, electrons, etc. Of course, science is not saying this is what they are. Science just has, they are models that describe what is observed. It's not saying this is real or not, but this model, mathematics, whatever it is, describes how it appears to behave, and then later on that might change. It's not reality, even though many scientists might think it is reality, but no, it's not.
I think a good scientist will tell you that.
Yeah.
But often there's a certain conceit that says, "Well, now we've figured it out. This is actually what's happening." But what's really meant is this is our current favourite theory. Yeah. There's also a very interesting little statement by Heisenberg, who's a very well-known physicist. And he said, and they said he was getting very old, and this person who was interviewing him said, Professor Heisenberg, you're getting very old, and probably you won't live too many more years. Do you have any questions in mind if you go to heaven and you meet the Almighty? Have you got any questions for him? He said, "Yeah, jawohl. And I have two questions." He says, "One, how did you do it? Two, why turbulence? Why turbulence?" And that, so interesting questions. So he was talking about the way that fluids work and turbulence, and he spent many years, along with this other work that he did in the subatomic world, the whole realm of turbulence and chaotic movement was fascinating to him. And he said, and when the journalist had that same sort of, "What? Turbulence? What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, so if you take a cubic centimeter of water and you move it through a distance of 1 centimeter, I could spend 100 years writing equations for what happens inside that little cubic centimeter of water, how everything flows and moves against each other." And I said, you couldn't represent mathematically what happens there. It's too complicated. It's so intricate and hyper complex. Even this in 1 cc of water moving through a distance of 1 centimeter. He says, and then I look out at the lake. I think he was in some kind of villa by the Zurich, near Zurich, in the Zuricher See. So then I look out at the lake and I see you have this thousands of hectares of water and waves moving in this direction and that direction, 3 or 4 directions at once. And he says, how can we ever conceive that we can figure it out? But that's one of the most, I think, valuable aspects of Buddha Dhamma, is that the Buddha had this insight right from the very beginning. Is like, you don't need to figure it out. You don't have to have mathematical equations or descriptions of how everything works. All you need to know is dukkha and the ending of dukkha. So that was part of his brilliance, was keeping people's attention like right on where it matters. And those teachings of the handful of leaves, where he's walking through the Singsapa forest and he bends down, picks up a handful of leaves and says, "What's greater in number, the leaves in my hand or the leaves on all the trees in the forest?" And it's a very, very famous story and example that's used. And they say, well, the leaves in your hand are very small in number and the leaves on the trees are uncountable. Well, so too, what I know is comparable to the leaves on the trees, but what I teach you is comparable to the leaves in my hand. And why do I not teach you all that other stuff? And is it because it's not conducive to understanding? It's not conducive to peacefulness. It doesn't lead to freedom. It doesn't lead to purity of heart. Therefore, I don't teach it. And what I do teach you, it does lead to peacefulness, leads to clarity, leads to purity of heart. And what do I teach you? I teach you suffering and the ending of suffering. And so it was a deliberate limitation of his range of teaching, very, very conscious and deliberate. It was like deliberately screening out 99.9% of what could be talked about. So this is what matters in this moment. Is there clinging? If there's clinging, let go. If there's letting go, what happens? Okay, what's the experience when the clinging stops? Okay, just do that. And that I feel that's it's very, very different from many other traditions, but it's extraordinarily skillful approach to teaching that we don't need to know. It can be frustrating to our mind that wants to figure everything out. Like, how do the five khandhas relate to the mental formations and sense consciousness of vijnana khandha? How is that different from sanya? And people write whole PhD theses about these things, and then argue with other PhD candidates why they are wrong. But as Ajahn Sucitto points out there, that it's just a good enough description to represent your experience of yourself and the world, and it's a good enough map that helps us to recognize the basic shape of things, so that we can keep our attention on what really matters, which is there dukkha, and can we bring about the ending of dukkha? So there's within the whole Buddhist tradition, there's no effort to make some sort of fundamental explanation of the life, the universe, and everything. And the Buddha names that the fundamental origin of things. He says it's one of the achinteya, the inconceivables. He doesn't give a story. There's no sort of ultimate origin story. There's descriptions of how a universe begins from the Big Bang, as it were. But he also says that's happened, inconceivable numbers of times, and that the ultimate beginning of things is achinteya, it's inconceivable, and so there's no point thinking about it. I used to have this pet theory that, there was a secret doctrine, that there was a sort of to the inner circle, the Buddha actually did pass on these all the other leaves in the forest, like Madame Blavatsky's secret doctrine, all the real interesting stuff. There was a kind of inner group that really knew, and it was for the general proletariat. They only got the Four Noble Truths, but the real inner circle got the juicy stuff. And I had these pet theories about how, maybe he passed it on to Rahula, and then Rahula took it off into the Himalayas or something. I was filled with a lot of really stupid, weird ideas when I arrived in the monastery. And then as the years have gone by, it's become more and more obvious. It's like, no, there's no. He meant what he said when he said, this is not worth talking about.
What are the other inconceivables?
The range of the mind of a Buddha or an enlightened being, all the workings of karma, and all the different levels of meditative concentration. So that the thinking mind, achinteya, literally means you can't think about it. So it's impossible to represent in thought or in concept or in word those different aspects of reality. You can give it a try if you like.